Now, I'd be the first to admit that the bike industry has in the past come up with some rather dubious marketing campaigns when it comes to convincing us all to go out and buy shiny new stuff. But this particular area of development has got a lot of its construct grounded in actual science. The two things holding us back most as bike riders are in fact aerodynamic drag and rolling resistance. And it might surprise you to find that using a wider tyre at a lower pressure can actually help to improve on both of these things. So I should say from the get-go though, that wider tyres and lower pressures on their own will not make us faster. As you'll see as we move through the steps in this video, it is about thinking about the wheel and tyre as a system. So the tyre doesn't work in isolation, it's obviously connected to a rim, and that is hugely important, how those two things interact and work together for optimal performance. Okay, so let's delve into the details, and we're going to start off by looking at rolling resistance. So how could a wider, softer tyre possibly create less rolling resistance? It doesn't stand to reason, right? It defies logic. It should feel soft and gooey and squidgy and slow, right? Well, no, that is not the case. And here is why. Now, rolling resistance is actually quite a complicated thing with a lot more factors influencing it than you might first realise. And now the first thing we're going to look at is the contact patch of the tyre, and specifically how that contact patch changes shape with a wider tyre. For that, I'm going to draw some simple diagrams. We don't have the budget, sadly, to pop up amazing graphics on the screen, so I'm going to just stick to old faithful whiteboard, but bear with me and hopefully all will become clear. Okay, so if we have a tyre viewed from the underside as you were riding along, let's say you're riding over a glass sheet and you were viewing from the underside, so you're seeing exactly what shape that tyre contact patch is from underneath as it strikes the ground. On a wider tyre, that contact patch would be sort of round like that. Okay, now a narrower tyre, run at exactly the same pressure, that's important, would have the same surface area to the contact patch, because that's governed by physics. So the surface area of these two patches would be equal, but the shape is clearly different. Now, that shorter, rounder contact patch is a significant influence to your rolling resistance. Why? Because if you view how that interacts with the ground from the side, so this is your wheel here, okay, this is the ground, and then that shorter, rounder contact patch here versus the same thing, excuse my bad drawings, but hopefully this will explain it for you, versus that longer, more sort of lengthened contact patch on the narrower tyre, basically means that less of the tyre's sidewall is deforming as you ride along at any one point, versus this one where there's more of the sidewall deforming. So effectively the wheel is losing less of its roundness, is something you might hear engineers say with this scenario. So that is how a wider tyre specifically reduces rolling resistance in one way. Now, another way to look at that is that this would have less rolling resistance at equal pressure. So therefore, you could say that you could, for equal rolling resistance, you could therefore drop the tyre pressure. So Continental recently, for instance, released some data where it had done some testing for a 20mm tyre. Rolling resistance was equal at 160 psi to a 28mm tyre at only 80 psi, so half the pressure for a 28mm tyre versus a 20mm tyre. So that has a number of implications to the modern day rider who wants to enjoy their ride and be comfortable on their bike, for instance. So tyre pressure is a huge influencing factor in the comfort that we feel as riders. So that again has a number of influences. So if we think about also having an inner tube in the system, the more that tyre sidewall is deforming, so going back to our narrower tyre example here, the inner tube is succumbing to exactly the same forces as the tyre carcass is in terms of deformation, but also it's adding friction into the system as that inner tube rubs the inner side of the tyre carcass too. So an inner tube actually adds quite a bit of rolling resistance. Butyl inner tubes add a bit more than perhaps a latex inner tube, but that's in itself, that's an argument for another video perhaps. And also we'll come back to running without inner tubes, i.e. a tubeless system, later in this video. Okay, what else does that mean? So having a tyre at a lower pressure obviously means more comfort. It also means more grip because the tyre can deform more readily around bumps in the road and therefore offer us more traction, more grip, more confidence in the handling of the bike because it's not deflecting off everything. And that deflection is also another key part of rolling resistance, which is not always well understood. So we don't ride on smooth surfaces. We're not on the boards of a velodrome. In that scenario, actually a higher tyre pressure with a narrower tyre would be better because we're riding on a perfectly smooth surface. So yeah, if we look at our road surfaces, we don't ride on smooth surfaces at all. The road is potholes and cracks and all kinds of other things we have to deal with as road riders. And actually, even at a microscopic level, the road surface itself is like a section of bumps and rocks and stones, effectively. So every one of those is an impact for the tyre as you ride along. And if every time your tyre is impacting one of those imperfections in the surface, it is bouncing up, you're effectively wasting energy. That's what it all boils down to. There's a huge amount of science to explain that with regards to unsprung weight versus sprung weight and how that changes and loses energy. But I won't delve into all of the details of that in this video, just to accept the fact basically that it's not a good idea for your rolling speed to be actually bouncing up and down. You're just wasting energy if your bike is doing it. And that is why high tyre pressures are not a good idea, because you would effectively just be deflecting your tyre off every single bump in the road. And while you might not be able to see them, that's happening all the time on even what looks like a very smooth tarmac road surface. That's still, going to be happening constantly. So a massive influence to rolling resistance. Added to that as well, which is an area which is only really just starting to be investigated by the bigger wheel and tyre brands, and that is rider fatigue. So it's hard to measure. I mean, you can measure power outputs with a power meter, but it's very hard to measure how much influence your muscles of your neck and your back and your shoulders and your arms are being affected by all of those vibrations that come through the bike. So this is a key area of development that's going on currently, and I'm sure we'll see manufacturers coming out with a lot of data about this in the coming months and years about how, again, wider tyres at lower pressures are going to save us a heap of energy. Okay, so that's a lot to take in so far. I hope you're still with me. The next thing we need to look at is how the tyre's shape is important with regards to speed and performance. Okay, so we've covered rolling resistance in some detail there, but now we're going to cover tyre shape and how that's important with a wider tyre. And that goes back to my original point about why a wider tyre on its own is not going to make you faster. And for that, I'm going to draw you another diagram on my whiteboard. So again, bear with me, but it will be easier for me to show you visually than it will be for me to try and explain this. So here goes. Let's look at a rim with a wider tyre fitted. So I'm going to draw you a cross section of a rim. So there's the rim bed there with the rim hooks, and let's make it a slightly aero wheel like so. So that would be your rim viewed if you'd sawed a cross section through your rim. And then if we fit the tyre into there, sits in the rim bed like so. Now, if that was a wide tyre, so you're going to get a shape much like this basically. Okay, so that's your wide tyre in a narrowish rim bed. So that's quite common in the current environment. You'll see that quite commonly. What would happen then if we change the dimensions of the rim to a wider internal width? So that rim was stretched out a little more. So had a slightly more kind of chubby aero profile. Again, something which we're seeing happen a lot with rim manufacturing these days. The shapes are definitely heading towards these wider rim profiles, and that is all to do with how the tyre interacts with that rim. As I said, it's all about how these two components work together as a system. That's really important to keep coming back to, because now if you look at how a tyre would sit in a wider rim profile, for instance, you see rims have gone from 17 mil internal widths through 19, 21, and now 23, and even 25 in some of the manufacturers. So this dimension here basically is growing. And what that means is when you put a wider tyre into this scenario, sorry, bad drawing, there we go, there's our wider tyre again. So if we had the same size tyre in a wider rim bed, what you have is less of what we might call the light bulb effect. So, to exaggerate it, a light bulb kind of looks like this, where in that scenario, that tyre would be completely unstable for a couple of reasons. One, you'd have the ability for that tyre to roll. So if you imagine, having that tyre being big and bulky, but only supported by a narrow rim, the tyre would feel unstable laterally, potentially, particularly if you did reduce the tyre pressure as well. The other thing was the sidewalls are not very well supported in this scenario. So again, imagine that tyre being able to be squished so much easier. Now, that goes back to the rolling resistance thing that we spoke about earlier, how much deformation there is in the sidewalls. It's a balancing act. So you want some deformation in the sidewalls, obviously, because actually a supple tyre is a good thing. a very sort of solid tyre isn't a good thing. That actually would increase your rolling resistance, and that goes back to the point about just bouncing constantly off of every imperfection in the road surface. So the other thing that this does, which is quite significant, and we'll talk more about shortly, is improves the aerodynamics as well, because in this scenario, again, you've got oncoming airflow potentially hitting your tyre, tracking around the edge of the tyre, and when you have this section here, which is quite a notched indent because you've got that wide tyre coming out of a narrow rim, the air catches in this section and turns turbulent, and you get a lot more resistance from, or less sort of nice laminar flow of that air from the tyre onto the rim surface. So that's where having this wider rim, and there's a huge amount of research, don't take my word for it, there's tons of research being done by the big brands such as Envy and Zip and those guys in this area at the moment, but why these wide rims work so much better for the wider tyres, because then the airflow can come down and stay much more laminar flow as it tracks from the tyre onto the rim, because you don't get this big indent here. Now I can actually show you that in some real products. I was lucky enough to make contact with some of my friends in the industry who provided me with these little cutouts. Now what's really interesting here is basically exactly what I've just been trying to draw very badly on my whiteboard. This is exactly the same size tyre pumped up to exactly the same pressure. So this is a 28mm tyre at 70 psi. This has an internal rim width of, I think, 17mm. This has an internal rim width of 23mm. So the difference isn't hugely visible at first glance until you start to really focus on the foam fill inside, which shows you the difference in the tyre air volume by using a tubeless system and by using a wider rim bed, but also crucially how much bigger the tyre looks and how much rounder the tyre looks. Okay, and those benefits, as I've started to touch on here, are quite marked in terms of our overall performance. So there's that stability of the tyre. When that sidewalls of the tyre in that sort of more inverted U profile, because the sidewall is, it's a bit like standing with your legs further apart. You're a much more stable object, and it's the same for a tyre. If the sidewalls are nicely parallel to the rim shape, it's so much more stable laterally, and that means that the carcass of the tyre itself can be significantly lighter and more supple, because it's not going to be subjected so much to that sort of loss of performance through that kind of deflection when it's squished out into a kind of balloon shape already. The other thing is the way that the tyre tread itself is now more in play over more of its surface area effectively. If you've got a very narrow tyre pumped up to a high pressure, you end up with this very tight curve on the tyre. You're only ever going to be in that sort of middle section of the tyre, even if you lean over, unless you're leaning miles over. So actually, as the tyre grows in its sort of shape to that more inverted U profile, you're able to use more of the tyre's actual treaded area. So again, that improves grip. So all these things are at play all at once. So it's quite a convoluted but also very intricate argument for why wider tyres work so well. But as you can see, all these features actually influence each other as well. So it's not just about one thing, it's about that system and how the tyre can work effectively with that rim shape. Now, there is one other thing to mention when we're talking about rim shapes as well, and that is the move to a hookless rim. So this is an even sort of newer technology which we're only starting to see trickling into high-end bike wheels recently. Now what that does, if I could just wipe one of these off. Okay, so if we took our rim with the hooked bead, like we talked about before, so even if this is a wide rim, the tyre still has to come around the rim hook within the rim profile. So you still, to an extent, get a little bit of that kind of indent here, which is what we talked about with regards to the aerodynamic benefits and the air getting trapped in that little space there and creating vortices and extra drag. So if you take away the actual hook within the rim, and now your rim looks more like this, again, excuse my bad drawing. Now when your tyre sits in here, you've got no hook pushing that tyre or pinching that tyre to an even narrower shape in here. So again, it's all about improving that ability for the tyre to have those more upright sidewalls, And also that's going to help with the stability, but also help with that airflow as we get that sort of laminar flow off the tyre sidewall and onto the rim. So again, this is a new area for high-end bike wheels. Hookless technology. Still, few people finding it difficult to be convinced that a hookless rim can potentially hold a tyre securely, but that is down to a company which is called ETRTO, which is basically a company that governs the tyre and rim specifications to make sure that now we work within really fine tolerances. So you will find that all the hookless rim manufacturers that are currently out there, of which there are now a few, all have a list of tyres which are effectively have been tested thoroughly, both by the rim manufacturers and the tyre manufacturers, to make sure they are safe, and there is no chance that there's any concerns over the safety of using hookless rims, providing the right tyre and rim combinations are adhered to. Okay, so another upside of the hookless rim technology, which we're starting to see as well, is that top-end wheel prices are coming down. Well, that is because actually it's cheaper to manufacture a hookless rim shape, because it's actually pretty complicated to, particularly in carbon, to mould in this shape that's required for that hook for the tyre bead. So this actually enables manufacturers to use a much simpler moulding process. It also means that the carbon fibres are not forced into really tight bends, which we know is bad for carbon fibre, so therefore the strength and stiffness of hookless rims is better too. So overall we're looking at lighter rims that are as strong and stiff, but actually cheaper to manufacture too, so that's got to be a plus. Now, hookless, I must stress, only is compatible with tubeless systems. The reason for that is you need the strength of the tubeless tyre bead in order to maintain that strong and safe connection with the rim, as I was saying about ETRTO and so on. That's really important. So yeah, hookless system has to be used tubeless. But going back to that rolling resistance point from earlier in the video, the tubeless system is all about helping you in any case. So the benefits of tubeless are vast. Again, we're looking at getting rid of that inner tube, reduces weight potentially. It reduces the frictional losses of the tube inside that tyre carcass. It enables the tyre sidewall to, be more supple as well in many regards. And with the sealant inside a tubeless system as well, we've got that added benefit of having the sort of puncture protection and then being able to seal those small punctures that we might pick up out on the road without us even knowing sometimes. So tubeless is another potentially big area for why running wider tyres at lower pressures. As well, obviously not having an inner tube in there means no pinch flats if you were unlucky enough to strike something that's hard edged on a ride, like a pothole. We're not having that inner tube in there means goodbye to pinch flats too. So yeah, I mean there's more benefits than downsides to tubeless. So why don't we just keep going wider and wider still? If the benefits are there, surely it would make sense to just keep going wider. Well, of course, as I said earlier in this video, it's all about a balancing act, and the wider tyres will obviously increase in weight, and also there is that consideration for the frontal area of a tyre with regards aerodynamics. So there is, I guess, a sweet spot, and it seems to be that we're landing at around the 28mm tyre as that kind of sweet spot. So much wider than that, potentially much beyond, maybe 28 to 30mm would be a good sweet spot in the current climate. Much beyond 30mm, the tyres do get that bit heavier, as I said, and then you would be looking at a significant increase in aerodynamic drag for that sort of oncoming wind. So that's why we can't just keep on going and going and going with this technology. There definitely is a balance to be struck. Okay, so I appreciate that's been a heap of information to dump on you in this video, so thanks if you've managed to watch it all the way through to the end. But let's summarise all that as sort of in a concise manner for you. If I can. So essentially, yes, it is now pretty much beyond doubt that with the modern rim shapes, a wider tyre and a tubeless tyre, particularly run at a lower pressure, will overall, as a system, be a faster setup than those sort of older, outdated thinking of narrow tyres pumped up to high pressures. So what does that mean? It means getting on board with at least a 28mm tyre. It means getting on board with tubeless technology and wider and specific hookless rim shapes for tubeless technology, and it means experimenting with those lower tyre pressures, and by that I mean down as low as potentially 50 psi depending on your body weight. If you're a sort of a 65 kilo rider, 50 psi would be fine in a 28mm tubeless road tyre these days. If you're a bit heavier, then obviously that tyre pressure has to creep up a little bit, but certainly nothing beyond about 75 psi even for a sort of heavier rider, and you'll find now that a lot of the rims may even state that there's a margin of safety on there where you can't go much above perhaps 75 or 80 psi in your tyres in any case. So yeah, it's all changed as far as that sort of mentality in tyre width and pressures go, but as far as I'm seeing from the testing that I've done, it's all for the better. Okay, hopefully you've enjoyed this video and liked it. If you did, do give us a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel too. That little button's just down in the bottom corner there, and also head over to cyclist.co.uk for all the latest news, tech and in-depth product and bike reviews. Thanks very much for watching, and see you next time.